feeling like she had already won. I felt my chest tighten and my hands grow cold. Because in that moment, I knew the fight for my husband's legacy had only just begun. Thank you for watching and giving me your time. It means more than I can say. And before I go on, I would love to know where you are watching from. So please leave me a comment below, because hearing from you makes these memories easier to share. And as I sat there in that courtroom with my heart heavy from loss, trying to hold on to my husband's memory, I never imagined that on top of mourning him, I would have to defend what he worked his whole life to build. Yet there I was with eyes on me, whispers circling the room, and the sound of her laughter cutting through my grief like a blade. My name is Margaret. I am 74 years old, and for most of my life I believed I had seen every shade of hardship a woman could endure. But nothing prepared me for that day when grief was mixed with humiliation and betrayal. I was born in a small town where people survived by the strength of their backs and the honesty of their word, and I carried those lessons into my marriage, into the years of raising my children, and into the long days and longer nights working beside my husband on the ranch. He was my partner, my strength, and the anchor that steadied me when the storms of life threatened to sweep us away, and together we turned rough land into something living, something worth passing on. Our home was not filled with riches, but with the sound of cattle lowing at dawn, the smell of fresh bread cooling by the window, and the creak of the rocking chair he built with his own hands. The ranch stretched wide, 1,850 acres of sweat and sacrifice, and though it took much from us, it gave us pride, it gave us purpose, and it gave us a future we believed would be secure. My husband often reminded me that land was more than dirt and fences. It was a legacy, a promise to those who came after us, and he swore that when he was gone, I would never be left with nothing. Still, I knew there were shadows from his past, whispers of the woman he once married long before he met me, a woman who walked away from him more than 25 years ago. He rarely spoke her name, and when he did, it was with a weight in his voice, a quiet sorrow quickly replaced by the warmth he gave me. And so I pushed those shadows aside, convincing myself they would never again touch the life we built. We had children, we had grandchildren, and though times were not always easy, we held together with faith and determination, leaning on each other when the world felt too heavy. So when I lost him, I believed at the very least I would be left with peace, a chance to grieve in silence, to walk the land we loved and feel his presence in every blade of grass and every fence post he hammered into the soil. But sitting there in that courtroom, surrounded by strangers and lawyers and family members with uncertain eyes, I realized that peace was not something I would be given. I would have to fight for it, and that fight would demand more strength than I had ever known I possessed. When my husband's health began to fade, I told myself I was ready, that I could handle the quiet of an empty bed and the echo of his voice lingering in the halls. But the truth is, you are never ready to watch the person who carried half of your soul slip away before your eyes. I remember the sound of the machines in the hospital room, the faint beeping that seemed to count down the moments I had left with him, and I remember how his hand felt in mine. Still rough from years of working the land, but weaker than I had ever known it to be. He looked at me with eyes that had seen every struggle we endured together, and with a faint smile he whispered that everything was in order, that I would be taken care of, that the ranch would remain mine because it was as much a part of me as it was of him. When he took his last breath, I felt the world grow colder, as if the air had been pulled from the room, and I sat frozen with my tears running silently, unable to imagine the days ahead without the sound of his boots on the porch, without the warmth of his laughter filling the kitchen, without the comfort of knowing he was out on the fields checking the fences. After the funeral, the house felt hollow, though every corner carried his memory, and each step I took reminded me of the promise he left me, the promise that I would not face the rest of my days in fear or without security. So when the letter from the lawyer arrived, calling me to the reading of his will, I dressed in quiet dignity, carrying with me not pride, but the deep sadness of a woman still mourning the man she had loved for a lifetime. I sat in that room surrounded by people whose eyes flickered between pity and curiosity. And though my heart was broken, I felt a small measure of relief when the lawyer's voice finally confirmed what my husband had assured me all along, that the ranch, the land, and the $500,000 he had worked so hard to save were left in my care. For a moment, I breathed easier, thinking the weight on my chest might finally lift, but it was in that very instant, just as my tears began to dry, that the heavy wooden doors swung open, and everything I thought I could count on began to tremble beneath me. The sound of those doors crashing open still echoes in my memory, and when I turned my head I saw her. The woman I thought belonged to the past. The one who had walked away from him decades ago, without a word of regret. She stood there in the doorway with her chin lifted high, her eyes scanning the room as if she owned it, and at her side was a boy who looked no older than 20, carrying himself with a pride that did not belong to him. She smiled, no, she smirked, and with a laugh that cut through the silence of the room, she announced that her son had every right to what my husband left behind. I sat frozen, my heart pounding, my fingers trembling in my lap, not because I believed her words, but because I could see the way people leaned forward, whispering, wondering if what she claimed could possibly be true. Her voice was sharp, filled with false confidence, as she told the judge and everyone present that blood always outweighs vows, that no matter how many years had passed, her son was the rightful heir, and that I had no claim to the land or the money that my husband had worked himself to the bone to provide. I wanted to speak, to rise from my chair and defend the life we built, but grief held me still. And I realized that sometimes silence speaks louder than any protest. The boy beside her never looked at me, only at the lawyer, with a smile that said he believed the world was about to hand him everything on a silver platter. I could feel the weight of eyes on me, waiting for me to crumble, waiting for me to shout or beg, but I lowered my gaze and held on to the memory of my husband's words. The promise he left me in the quiet of his last night. Inside, anger began to burn through the sorrow, a slow, steady flame that told me I would not be broken, that the truth I carried was stronger than any lie that woman could throw against me. And so I sat there, my face calm though my heart beat like a drum, letting her laugh, letting her boast, because deep inside I knew something she did not, something that would turn her laughter into ashes before the day was done. The room grew heavy with her words, her laughter circling me like a storm cloud that refused to pass, and yet I remained still, because I knew that rushing to defend myself would only give her more ground to stand on. She raised her voice again, telling the judge that my husband had once loved her, and that the boy at her side was living proof of that love. And with each sentence she spoke, I could hear the whispers in the crowd grow louder, as if they were already convinced that my place in that room was about to vanish. I folded my hands tightly together, forcing myself to breathe slow, because I had learned long ago that silence can be sharper than a blade. That sometimes the most powerful answer is no answer at all. Inside I could feel grief pressing against anger, two heavy weights pulling at my chest, but I would not let either one spill over, not yet. I watched her circle the table with her words, watched her try to pull sympathy with false tears, watched her boy sit tall as if the ranch and the money had already been written in his name. And I thought of my husband, of the way he promised me that I would never be left unprotected. She believed she was winning in that moment, that her noise was drowning me out, but what she could not see was that beneath my quiet face I carried truth. And truth does not need to shout to be heard. The judge's gavel struck the desk, demanding order, and still she would not stop, insisting that the ranch belonged to her son, insisting that I was nothing more than a woman who took what was never meant for me. Her voice rose higher, but mine stayed low within me, because I knew the day would come when the evidence I held would speak louder than any insult, louder than any lie, louder than the cruel laughter she tried to bury me under. So I stayed seated, my heart steadying itself, waiting for the moment when silence would break, not with noise, but with undeniable proof. When the judge finally raised his hand for quiet, his voice cut through the noise, and he ordered that if such a claim were to be taken seriously, there would need to be proof, and that proof would come in the form of a DNA test. For the first time that day, her smirk faltered, only for a moment. But I saw it, and in that flicker I felt a small measure of strength return to me. The boy shifted in his seat, trying to look confident, yet I could see the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his eyes avoided the judge's gaze. I did not speak, not yet, but in my heart I whispered a prayer that the truth my husband had left behind would finally rise to the surface. The days that followed were the longest I had ever known. Nights stretched endlessly as I walked the empty halls of the ranch house, my footsteps echoing against wood that once carried the weight of his boots. I would stand by the window staring out across the fields, remembering his words, hearing him tell me that this land was my home, that no one could ever take it from me. And those memories became the only light in a darkness filled with doubt. There were moments when fear threatened to swallow me, moments when I asked myself if lies could really outshout truth, if the greed of others could destroy everything we had built. But then I would open the drawer where I kept his letters, each line written in his steady hand, each word reminding me that he never left me unprotected. As the day of the hearing drew closer, I grew quieter, not out of weakness, but out of resolve, because I understood that battles are not always won with shouts or threats. Sometimes they are won by patience, by waiting for the right moment to place your hand on the table and let the world see what cannot be denied. She walked around town as though victory was already hers, telling anyone who would listen that the ranch and the money were about to belong to her son. But I kept my silence, holding close to the knowledge that the truth was already written, sealed, and waiting for its moment to speak. When the morning of the hearing arrived, I rose before the sun, the house still heavy with the silence of his absence, and I sat for a long time at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands. I thought of all the years we spent building that ranch, of the sweat that dripped from his brow, of the way his hands carried both tenderness and strength. And I told myself that if I stayed steady, if I carried his memory with dignity, then I could face whatever storm waited for me. I took the folder from the drawer, the one that held more than just papers. It held the truth of a life lived honestly, and I pressed it against my chest as if it were his embrace. At the courthouse, I walked slowly down the hallway, each step echoing against the walls. And though people turned to look at me with curiosity or pity, I kept my head lifted, because I was not there to argue or beg. I was there to show what he had left behind for me. Sitting inside, I noticed the familiar face of our old ranch lawyer, a man who had stood by my husband through many battles, and when our eyes met, he gave me the smallest nod, a quiet gesture that reminded me I was not as alone as I felt. He leaned closer when I sat down and whispered that everything was prepared, that we only had to be patient, and those words gave me a steadiness I clung to in the chaos of that room. Across from me, she sat with her boy, smiling, as if she had already claimed the ranch, her hands tapping impatiently on the table, her eyes darting around with the restless energy of someone convinced the world would bend to her will. I could feel the anger simmering inside me, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that hardens, the kind that sharpens your resolve until you no longer fear the noise around you. She believed her laughter could drown out the truth. She believed her lawyers could twist reality to match her greed. But I carried something deeper, something she could not touch. And that was the knowledge that my husband had trusted me enough to leave me not only the land and the money, but also the proof that would silence every lie. As the judge entered and the room fell quiet, I placed the folder on the table in front of me, my hands steady now, my heart no longer trembling, and I knew that whatever came next would not be decided by her words or her arrogance, but by the truth that I had carried with me, waiting for this very moment to be revealed. The judge's voice filled the room, steady and commanding, reminding everyone that the matter before us was not one of feelings or memories, but of facts and evidence. And as he spoke, I felt the air shift, as if the weight of the moment pressed down on every soul present. She rose quickly, her lawyer at her side, spilling words like a rushing river, insisting that her son was the rightful heir, that bloodlines cannot be denied, and that I had no right to hold on to land and money that she claimed belonged to him. Her laughter broke through again, sharp and mocking, and the boy sat there with his shoulders squared, a smile tugging at his lips as though the decision was already written in their favor. I sat quietly, my hands resting on that folder, and I let them talk, let them laugh, let them paint their picture, because I knew the time for my voice had not yet come. The judge listened with patience, though I could see in his eyes the weariness of a man who had heard too many lies dressed as truth. And when her lawyer finished, she leaned back in her chair, smirking, certain that I would crumble under the weight of their words. But I did not move, not even when she turned her gaze on me with the satisfaction of someone who believed victory was already in her grasp. When the judge finally turned his attention to me, asking if I had anything to present, I felt the stillness in the room deepen. Every eye fixed on me as though they expected to see a broken woman rise and plead. Instead, I slid the folder forward, my fingers steady, my voice calm as I said, only that everything the court needed to know was inside. A ripple of whispers moved through the room. Her smirk faltered just for a breath, and the boy's confidence seemed to crack at the edges. But I kept my eyes on the judge, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing fear or anger. In that moment, silence became my ally, for it carried more weight than her shouting, more strength than her laughter. And as the judge opened the folder and began to read, I knew that the tide had begun to turn, not because of noise or spectacle, but because truth, once placed in the light, cannot be ignored. The judge lifted the first page, his eyes moving slowly across the lines, and with every second of silence that passed, the room grew tighter, until you could almost hear the sound of hearts pounding in their chests. Her smirk began to waver, her fingers tapping against the table with a rhythm that betrayed her nerves, and the boy shifted uncomfortably, no longer sitting so tall. The judge cleared his throat, his voice steady as he announced that the documents contained letters written in my husband's own hand, letters where he spoke plainly of his past, of the mistakes he made, and of the certainty that the woman who had left him so long ago was never truthful about the life she claimed to have built afterward. Gasps spread through the room, whispers like a rising wind, but the judge raised his hand for quiet and turned to the next page. This time his words carried a finality that cut through every doubt, because it was the DNA results, sealed and signed by the proper authorities, and his voice did not waver as he read the conclusion aloud, stating that the boy standing beside her was not my husband's son, had never been his son, and that the claim laid before the court held no ground. The sound of her gasp tore through the silence, sharp and unsteady, and before I could even lift my head, she stumbled back, her knees giving way beneath her as she collapsed into her chair, her laughter gone, replaced by a pale and trembling face. The boy's confidence vanished in an instant, his shoulders dropping, his eyes staring down at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. For me, it was not joy that filled my heart, but a wave of relief so strong that tears pricked my eyes, because in that moment, I knew my husband's promise had held true, that his words to me in those final days had not been empty comfort, but a shield against the lies that others would try to use to destroy me. I sat still, letting the truth do its work, letting the weight of the evidence silence every whisper, and though I did not speak, my silence now carried strength, the kind that cannot be denied, the kind that rises above noise and greed, to stand unshaken in the light of justice. The judge set the papers down with a firmness that left no room for doubt, his voice steady as he declared that the claim had been dismissed, that the ranch and the inheritance rightfully remained in my hands, and in that single moment, the weight of weeks of fear lifted from my shoulders. I did not rise, I did not cheer, I did not speak, for there was no need. The truth had spoken on my behalf, and it had spoken louder than any insult or laughter that had been thrown my way. Across the room, she sat frozen, her face drained of color, her eyes wide with disbelief, as though she could not grasp how her lies had crumbled so quickly. And beside her the boy remained silent, his pride melted away, his shoulders slumped, his gaze locked on the floor where no one could see the shame written across his expression. People began to murmur, some shaking their heads, some glancing at me with softened eyes, but I kept mine steady, focused on the papers that proved my husband's loyalty even after death. Because this victory was not about humiliation or revenge, it was about honor, about protecting the life and legacy of a man who gave everything he had to the land we loved. I could feel the fire in my chest cool into something calmer, something stronger, a quiet dignity that reminded me that sometimes justice does not come with shouting or triumph, but with silence that leaves no room for argument. As I gathered the folder into my hands and rose from my chair, the shuffle of feet filled the room. But I did not look back at her or the boy, because I knew their downfall was not mine to savor. My steps were slow, measured, each one carrying me closer to the door and farther away from the bitterness that had tried to poison my grief. And when the heavy doors closed behind me, I let out a breath I had been holding for far too long. A breath that carried away sorrow, fear, and doubt, leaving behind only the quiet strength of a woman who had stood against lies and had walked away with truth still intact. When I stepped back onto the land that evening, the sun was sinking low, and the fields stretched out before me in golden light, and for the first time since his passing, I felt a sense of peace settle deep in my chest. I walked slowly across the yard, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes, and I carried the folder close to me, not because I needed to prove anything further, but because it felt like carrying his hand, his promise, his faith in me. The house stood waiting, quiet and strong, and as I crossed the threshold, I felt the warmth of memories rush back, every corner filled with his laughter, every wall holding the echo of his voice, and I knew then that no one could take that from me. I sat by the window, his old hat resting on my lap, the one he wore every morning when he went out to check the fences, and I traced the brim with trembling fingers, thinking of how he always told me that land remembers the hands that care for it. Outside, the cattle moved steady and calm, the fields stretched wide and open, and it was as though the earth itself was telling me that his spirit still lingered, that every piece of this ranch still carried the mark of his love and labor. My heart ached, but it no longer ached with fear. It ached with gratitude, because even in death he had shielded me, even in silence he had left me the strength to withstand those who tried to tear me down. In that quiet, I realized the lesson buried in all that pain, that betrayal will always try to disguise itself as truth. But real truth never wavers, it never bends, it waits patiently for its moment to rise. I leaned back, the fading light falling softly across the room, and I whispered a thank you to him, not just for the land and the money, but for the wisdom he left me. Wisdom that taught me that justice does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and when it does, the whole world listens. As night settled over the ranch, I stood at the doorway and looked out across the fields, the same fields my husband and I had poured our lives into, and I felt a calmness I had not known in weeks. The lies had been silenced, the truth had stood firm, and I had walked through grief, betrayal, and fear, only to find myself still standing with dignity intact. I understood then that strength does not always come from loud battles or angry words. Sometimes it comes from holding your ground quietly, from trusting that what is right will shine through, no matter how dark the storm becomes. My heart carried sorrow, yes, but also pride, because I had honored him, I had protected what we built, and I had learned that even in the hardest moments, silence and truth can be the greatest form of justice. Thank you, my dears, for staying with me until the very end of my story. Your presence means more than I can ever say. And if my words touched you, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this story so others may find strength in it too.